Hello and welcome to the TTI Distribution Download, the podcast where we talk about all things happening in the world of electronic components with the specialists of TTI. And now, your host for the TTI Distribution Download, Paula Renfrow.
Thanks, Jim. Hey, everybody, and thanks for plugging into the TTI Distribution Download. This episode, we're welcoming Dennis Reed from Edgewater Research as a regular contributor to the program. Hey, Dennis, welcome. Thanks for being here, and how's it going?
Paul, it's going great. Thank you guys very much for having me.
So let's start off. Tell us a little about yourself and the work that you do with Edgewater.
I'm a senior research analyst at Edgewater Research. We're a leading market intelligence company, really as a company focusing on three high-level industries. So technology, or hard tech, as we like to call it, so the component world, and then consumer and the digital. Within technology, we're split between two groups. The first being compute, so that focuses on things like CPUs, GPUs, memory, rotating medias like hard drives. And then on my team, we focus on what we call our component insights franchise. So that covers, what we'll call the broadline semiconductor industry, the IP&E space, and then the broader component distribution world. So my area focuses, on those channels where you have suppliers that have 50, 75, 100,000, type part numbers that, no single customer is like 50% of sales, right? It's more of that broader industrial, automotive, transportation world.
Like what we do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let me be sure everybody also knows that Dennis recently joined us also as a weekly contributor to Market Eye. We're very excited about that. So this month in Market Eye, Dennis, you published a market conditions report for Q1. Let's dive into that report a little bit if we can, and specifically what the supply chain and inventory market is looking like right now.
I think if you boil down the industry overall at the high level and you think about it from a cyclical standpoint, fundamentally, I would say demand is fine. So we have really no concerns about the long-term demand drivers, whether that's automotive, whether that's the industrial, medical, aerospace, or defense markets. We have really no concerns about kind of those structural long-term growth drivers. Fortunately, near term, what we're dealing with is a cyclical inventory correction. So I think when you look, exiting the fourth quarter of the year, and we're kind of in the midst of reporting season right now, when you look at some of the publicly traded companies, the focus is burning inventory, Paula. So, exiting the fourth quarter, just to put some numbers around that, we saw inventory dollars down, kind of 3-ish% year over year. So clearly some progress. We saw the days on hand down, close to 2% year over year. So we're making progress on the inventory, but that progress is kind of slow going. So we're still at an area where we're, call it 45 to 50% above those levels that we were entering COVID and entering the shortage. So, I think inventory at the high level remains kind of a headwind. I would be remiss not to say that, inventory is not really all created equal right now. So in some of those subcategories that we follow, I think there's a key differentiation between the semiconductor world and the IP&E world. So, and a lot of that to us stems back from the proliferation of non-cancelable, non-returnable programs that were really championed by the semi companies. So I think, the good news with that, which, of course, that's a pretty cautious or guarded tone, we feel pretty comfortable in the IP&E space. In particular, that inventory levels, especially exiting the first quarter level, are relatively healthy. And, I think it's even relatively safe to say you can call a quote unquote bottom for IP&E cyclically in the first quarter. And we'll start to resume growth as we move throughout 24 and into 25. I think I'd be remiss to say, we're not expecting kind of that hockey stick snapback. I mean, there's some other geopolitical turmoil, elections, inflation, some of those things that are persistent. But when you just look overall, some of that cyclicality of it, we feel pretty good that IP&E's bottom. There's still some work in the semi side, as I mentioned. So, maybe we find that bottom here in 2Q or 3Q. And, when you look at the distribution side, I think it becomes to kind of an end market mix or product mix and kind of where that shuffles from an individual distributor standpoint.
Yeah, so we talked so much about semiconductors and supply chain disruption 3 years ago now, probably. Time's really flying. And you mentioned NCNR, non-cancelable, non-returnable. Are you seeing changes in those policies? Because I know so much of that is an indicator for the rest of us.
Yeah, it's a great, I think if you go back 3 years, and it's hard, it feels like in one hand we blinked and we were back there.
Right. There was a ship in the canal.
Yeah, when you go back to the start of them, we were always in the camp that the use of non-cancelable, non-returnable programs was going to be problematic for customers, distributors, EMS partners, et cetera. And so you could see that case from kind of that buy side of the transaction, if you will. On the sell side, if you're a supplier, I could certainly understand, especially in semis, if one company put an order in and you committed a wafer and it was short, you're taking that wafer at the expense of somebody else who might need it. So it's a tough spot to be in. It's something I think just plays to kind of the cyclicality overall. When you measure it to individual suppliers and I'm not going to kind of pick on or name anybody individually. I think some people handled it a little better than others. And the ones that did, I think, quickly reacted when supply or availability kind of started to catch up. They pivoted and softened the stance a little bit. They may have horse traded those opportunities for future design wins, things like that, work to extend terms in the agreement. But at the end of the day, conceptually, they didn't think that it made business sense to just force product on their distribution partners or their customers. So, those types of guys, I think, have fared better. Where we sit, now in mid-May or early May of the year, all of the non-cancelable programs have effectively been unwound. In the semi space, I think, lead times are basically 6 to 8 weeks. There's ample semi supply all over the place, including some of the, the gray market or excess channels. So that competition, if you will, has forced the industry to kind of abandon them. I think when you go forward, probably the most important thing, so that's obviously looking backwards. Again, I think I've maybe reshape my thoughts on the use of the non-cancelables. And again, I could understand it on that sell side of the transaction where you're looking for protection, partnership, greater visibility, right?
So much customization. Yeah.
Yeah, I could understand that. But I think, if you get into this environment where, and this is a hypothetical where, you're asking distributors and customers to put a 6-month rolling backlog, hypothetically. And, when there's significant supply availability or sufficiency, you have a 35, 45 day, 30, 45 day window of cancellation. When things get tight, if you extend that to 90, let's say hypothetically, I think that can work where you have some level of protection built in. But again, I think when you can't go back to that place where at the end of the day, you just force product that people don't need.
Yeah, share the pain, share the risk a little better.
Yeah, 100%. So I think, greater dialogue. I think, and distribution's a great partner. EMS is a great partner. The semi guys are all great companies too. I do tip the hat to the IP&E suppliers. I mean, they did bring non-cancelable programs in, but I think, again, when they saw lead times come down, they offered some flexibility in that time. And that, to us is fundamental why cyclically we feel that IP&E's kind of past the worst of it in returning to growth. And we're kind of muddling through semis right now.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, when we were chatting the other day, you mentioned having just come back from Embedded World. So two trending topics I know we were chatting about, EV and AI, that's electric vehicles, of course, and artificial intelligence. And boy, EV, we were talking about it with friends and colleagues a lot lately. It's just taken quite a hit. I'm hearing people say, consumers, I just can't make it pencil out. So how are you seeing the market react to this?
Yeah, so EV's an interesting one, and yeah, I'll say a couple of things, and I think we'll dig maybe a little bit more into the embedded world with the AI side than EVs. It was a little more centered around there, but in the EV marketplace, a couple of years ago,
Hmm.
I had done a couple of presentations and rolled out really optimistic forecasts, and forecasts that were calling for call it 50, 55 million EVs in a year by the year 2040. So I think, if you look at where we sit now, to your point, Paul, it's a different market and feel near term, but I would stand by those 2040 targets. What's different now, and I think this is at the crux of it, especially when you talk to people here in the West, is kind of the OEM and in the makeup and a little bit, the Gartner hype cycle always kind of holds true. And I'll give kudos to a competitor there.
Okay.
But when you went back a couple of years ago, you had the leading OEM in the West, and they had some very definitive competitive advantages, right? They were first to market. They had figured out how to make the vehicles and scale. They had a battery technology, even though they open sourced it. So they were, quote unquote, kind of a real car company, if you will, and they were being chased by all of your traditional internal combustion engine OEMs, and they were also being chased by emerging EV suppliers. And I think when we look at it, and this is where you're seeing really some of the fallout, if you look at those internal combustion engines, and each OEM obviously has their own strategic direction and strategies, but by and large, in a general sense, the internal combustion engine OEMs are very good at making cars in scale. They're not overly fast, they're not overly nimble. And so what they tried to do is kind of leapfrog that hybrid stage and chase the leading OEM. Where they were lacking, I think, is that flexibility to pivot. If they want to change design direction, model years, et cetera, like right now where the EV market has pumped the brakes a little bit, the hybrid market still looks good. All indications are, they'll retool designs, and those new production designs won't be in the market until model year 27 or 28. So we're talking, October of 26 at the earliest. So I think they're a little slow, and I think that's a challenge, and that would be my call to action
Hmm.
for any of those OEMs
Yeah.
is you've got to be quicker. When you look,
Yeah, the consumer does not act that way these days, right?
no,
That's too far.
no, they're and you could take that a little bit into the design, and these are obviously, more components in it, and when you think of those designs, by the time there's a 3 to 5 year, they're already designing vehicles with kind of legacy technology in it because the industry moves so fast. So I think, the challenge to those traditional internal combustion engines is to get faster, right? When you look at some of the emerging EV companies, in particular in the West, the challenge to them is can they build a vehicle and scale and really ramp manufacturing? And I think, and we're not economists, but you could just look at the Fed funds rate, and some of those companies, it's a lot harder to raise debt, to raise equity, whatever financial transaction you need when you're in an environment where the Fed funds rate's 5.5%, right? So your risk-free rate's 5.5% versus zero. The returns that people demand are greater. So I think, for some of those emerging ones, that's the challenge they have. Now, what's been remarkable about EV has been the emergence of some of the Chinese-based OEMs. And if you look, and I would challenge people just to go online. When you look at the leading Chinese OEM, the old thought process that China makes, lower quality, lower spec, whatever it might be. And in some of their EV platforms, it's drastically different. So they look good, they perform well. And some of those OEMs are aggressively expanding with plans to build factories in Mexico, throughout Eastern Europe, and really attack some of those emerging areas. So again, I think, for EV to tie it all up, those long-term numbers, I think we still feel comfortable with. The makeup of the OEMs probably look a lot different than 2 years ago. And for some of the Western ones that are more emerging in there, I think they've still got some more work to do. So yeah, I think that's how we're viewing EV right now. Pivoting a little bit to the AI side and tying that into embedded world, this was probably the biggest shock to me, or takeaway to me, when I thought about AI in general. I was thinking that the chat bots and chat GPTs and the hyperscaler market. And to date, that has been the primary driver, but that's been a really a rising tide only raises one ship, meaning the leading processor company for AI based systems. But when you went to embedded world, it was really all of the components and or ecosystem that is needed to create real world applications. So and I think there's a whole bunch of kind of sub verticals that get tied in. So to give you an example, Paula, like you would walk into a booth and you would see somebody building an AI software stack into a 32-bit microcontroller that could be used in parallel with various sensors and what have you. And you could use that for a security system or factory automation and monitoring, right? So I think we, and I've been as guilty as anybody when I thought about AI, that really wasn't a thing until about 2 years ago, and now is north of $100 billion market in the semi side. It's all been kind of consumer centric, the chat bots, things like that. And the hang up for me has always been, how do you tie it into industrial 4.0 or IoT or connected world, smart grids and things like that? Because it just didn't seem at the time, as you were setting these systems in place, that we were headed that way. Embedded world somewhat reshaped that. There's clearly people that are focusing on leveraging that type of compute power, but bringing it in and kind of connecting us all over the world. So it was pretty telling to see various use cases and things like that are just outside of what you see right now, that gets a lot of media publication, if you will.
It makes me think of, we used to say, what's the next killer app? We talked about that relative to handhelds, tablets, those kinds of things, like, and memory requirement, right? We're going to need the next killer app. That sounds a little like what you've just puts me in mind of what you've just described. So we've had these applications, but now we have this capability to have a whole nother application, and that's going to drive the market?
I think in general, whether it's been, if you go way back, whether it was like the Nokia candy bar phones, or then the smartphone, then it became the iPhone, the tablet, right? All those things have been the killer app. And I agree. I think to some extent, we've talked a little bit about things that are a little bit more opaque, because it's not just a unit times price type margin. It's hard to measure IoT growth, right? Or or things
Right.
like that, for a couple of reasons. One, it's diverse customer base. Two, you're seeing the lines blur between end markets. If you look at healthcare, I would challenge you, something like a Whoop armband that tracks, heart rate, body skin temperature. Is that a consumer device because it's sold to the consumer? Or do you have a way that you wire it to your primary care physician? All of a sudden it becomes a medical device, right? You're seeing all those lines kind of blur. But what ties it together, I think, when you think about, how AI how, any of these
Mm-hmm.
things,
Mm-hmm.
you're really, really connecting different devices. So what is in monitoring and measuring things and then trying to predict what's going to happen from them. So, what does that at a high level require while the lines get blurred by end markets and in various, buzzwords? It requires a ton of sensing and or measuring. It requires a lot of computing horsepower.
Mm-hmm.
It requires connectivity, whether it's 5G or 6G on the comm or things like that. And it requires a lot of data. So, those are kind of the four big buckets that underpin all of those. And I think in I understand it's always challenging, but if you try to just highlight the one killer app, I think the walls are all getting blurred a little bit where it's hard to pick one thing, even though, those are kind of the underpinnings that keep us optimistic about the industry long term.
Yeah, so let's talk about, I like to think, coming from a manufacturing background, I often think in terms of, is it capability or capacity? So capability, are you seeing a change in, I'm going to say, engineering capability requirements? Does that make sense? Are the or is it a are the engineers approaching, are they required to approach differently?
Yeah, I think the biggest, and this is a little bit of a kind of near term, when you think at the heart of an engineer, they're solving today and tomorrow's problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's at the heart. And then, again, I'll keep it with a little bit more buzzwords there. So then from there, you jump into, form, fit, and function to solve those problems, right? As you design a board and you evaluate various components and everything else. The biggest one that we've seen that's added to that is form, fit, function, and supply chain. And I think, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
there's geopolitics in play. There's fresh, painful memories from the shortages. There's a whole host, but I think when you look at what is coming across from our customer desk, the engineer is not expected to be a supply chain professional, but they have to be aware in the supply chain engages maybe a little earlier, where typically you design the board, you kicked it over to supply chain, they in procurement, they procured it, and you moved on your way. Whether it's being an engineer that's understanding, the optionality of manufacturing globally, and where if you're a sole source, the facilities in Taiwan and there's other facilities in Malaysia or Hong Kong or wherever it might be, right? They're looking at it more from like an optionality standpoint. And especially in the West. So I think that's probably the biggest change. But in a high level, in a general sense, I mean, how people design they're envisioning solutions to fix problems of today and tomorrow. And I don't think that's changed too much, but just how they do it's a little bit different.
We talked about EV and talked about AI. What else do you see for 2024? We did a little look back. What are you thinking looking forward?
Yeah, so I think, unfortunately, and the AI, the EV, those are, what we would say is kind of the long-term secular growth drivers, right? So those are in place. Cyclicality still is going to reign supreme, and that kind of goes back to where we started with inventory. So I touched on it a little bit. We feel comfortable for IP&E that we've reached the bottom. So coming out of that market conditions webinar, we had raised our 2024 forecast for IP&E from kind of flat to up kind of 3-ish% year over year. So the trajectory of that is kind of you reach that bottom in 1Q, and you start to ship to consumption, and you move forward with a cyclical side. Like the inverse of that, I think, is the semi side, where we were up 3-ish, kind of 4-ish%, and we cut that to flat from an ex memory standpoint. And that's all the inventory side. So I think that kind of reigns. And even though we feel comfortable saying IP&E has bottomed, when you dig it out for the year, yeah, I'd call 2024 a transition year. I've heard some people echo reset. I don't think reset's kind of the right word. I like transition
Hmm.
because
Yeah. What's the difference in your
yeah,
mind?
reset to me and implies that, hey, we've reset the bar and we're going back to the way it is, right? Where I look at the transition and say, we came out of these shortage induced hyper growth. You look at semis in like 22 was like a 23 or 24% year over year number. It was, I think, 7% in 2021 was 16, 17%, right? We obviously grew above trend. Last year, which the WSTS, I think, will roll their forecasts out. We think the X memory is probably down 13 to 14. That's clearly below trend. We've got flat for this year. And then, you're kind of resetting in semis or IP&E. Again, even being up, call it 3%. You're kind of transitioning back out of shortage to too much to normal, and we're transitioning to kind of real growth. So I think, long term,
Mm.
we still think, IP&E is kind of a 5-6%, where long term semis are probably closer to that 6 to 8 range. Really, the delta there is just the price the semi guys command with new product introductions as they roll through. So, I don't think we're going to get to that number in 2024 for either of those, but we feel pretty okay that the inventory should really be in a good space exiting this year across
In a good
everything.
space for growth.
For growth, correct.
Yeah. So that being the difference, right? So like more of a running start than a standing reset.
Exactly. So you look at it, you started this year and you had inventory as a headwind. You go into next year, it's at least neutral, if not a tailwind, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's why we use kind of the term transition. We're transitioning back to long-term growth drivers that should be realized in 2025.
Yeah. If not, yeah. If not for
Right,
the
correct.
upsets that we experienced, the unanticipated.
No, correct. And like I said, we still think, for 2024, we still think, and we've raised our number for IP&E. So it's still kind of that low single digit range, which is up 2 or 3 points from where we were. So transitioning to growth 100%, but then, I think that growth kind of builds it when that you don't have a quarter of kind of headway to work through the inventory.
Yeah, feels better than this time last year. Anything for Q1 that I should have asked you about?
Gosh, good question there. Yeah, I think we've covered a lot. I think, the biggest one when I look at our customers, we touched on really the two big ones, what's going on cyclically, when does this bottom, and what's kind of the shape and trajectory coming out of it, more importantly.
Mm-hmm.
And then, what's going on with EVs in the West. I think it's pretty easy for people in our end to get a little out over their skis, to borrow that cliche, on the trajectory that we saw in EVs through the COVID years. So, you've reset. Is that just a product cycle that's over? And we don't think so. It's just a product cycle that looks different, and you've had kind of the early adopters run through,
Yeah.
and now you've got to compete. So, yeah, those are the two big ones, I think, that constantly show up with our customer base.
So we will touch on those again next quarter. Yes, you'll come back, join us again.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure to be here, and looking forward to touching base in 90 days.
Oh, thank you. Us too. So thanks to our listeners for plugging in today. And if you learned a little something, then tune in next quarter. Dennis has just agreed to join us, and we'll chat about the market. We'll chat about the forecast, and of course, EVs and AI will still be hot. Until then, you can follow Dennis weekly and our other industry subject matter experts at tti.com/market.
That's it for this episode of the TTI Distribution Download. For more information on any of the topics you heard about today, reach out to your nearby TTI branch at 1-800-CALL-TTI or visit us online at tti.com.